Hi, good morning, everyone. Glad you're back. This is the ONA Needs and Housing Production Technical Advisory Committee meeting number 8. This morning we are going to dig into quite a few details about translating the ONA targets. Those are the numbers that the state will be producing for local jurisdictions on housing production. And discussing ways and opportunities and challenges with translating that into type, characteristic, and location in the goal 10 process. And we'll be getting some pros and cons. We'll be digging in, and I believe this conversation, parts of it will continue on to next week. So just stay tuned with that, and hopefully that relieves any anxiety about how much we're about to accomplish here. We also have Elise Cordell with Oregon Housing Community Services Department to walk us through the sort of overview of where they are with the ONA dashboard and the equity indicators. That process is running in parallel. I know you all have been asking for more information on that, so she'll share a little bit more. They're midstream, so she'll share how to track along as it moves. And then it'll also be really helpful background for our discussion today. I will point out in the room this morning, we have Madi and Celestina, our colleagues at DLCD that are really helping lead the work under this TAC. We also have our subject matter expert and LCDC Commissioner Alan Lazo. Thank you, Alan, for being here and your commitment to this. And we're joined by Lorelei Gentinen, who's with Echo Northwest, part of the consultant team I work with on this. She's here as a subject matter expert and will be helping fill in any gaps if they come up. And other staff, I mentioned Elise is here, and I know that I saw Thea, I think she's here with DLCD, and of course Ingrid, who is making all of this happen this morning. Apologies, I'll pick up if I missed anyone else from the team here, but I'm really glad everyone's here. With that, I'm not going to delay. I'm going to get us moving on. Madi, I think you're set up for walking us through the racial equity framework considerations for the day.
Yes, thank you, Deb. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. I'll be grounding us in the racial equity framework. This is, just a typical process, a typical element of our process that we've been including in the NAPTAC and just generally in the rulemaking process for the ONA implementation under this work. And specifically today, I'll be noting two categories from the racial equity framework. They're the same two that we spotlighted, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? Yeah, last week. These are obviously, yeah, the days are blurry for me sometimes with the high pace, but last meeting. And I do want to apologize because I did have an oversight on the agenda in that specific section of the racial equity framework where I failed to update the specific topic area for today. You'll see that the fair housing issue areas remained on the agenda, but today we are not speaking to that. We're shifting back to the first topic area of our scope for the needs and production TAC, which is the translation of characteristics, types, and location. And so that is kind of the focus today. And the two categories that were from the framework are section 6 and 7, specifically talking about restorative justice and accountability. On the restorative justice side, I'm going to quickly note the questions for you all to consider and kind of lean on and lean through, right, as a lens as you are engaging in the discussion in the second part of our meeting. So with that, let me begin here. Does the rule provide restorative justice measures for the communities most burdened? If yes, what are they? If no, what would you suggest that is within the jurisdiction of the state of Oregon? And what are some other best practices or examples that restorative transformation justice measures would address or could address the impact of the rule on the most burden? So think about that. Think about just this topic area as it intersects with the translation piece. The second category is accountability. And Celestina noted this last week, so I'll just remind us here that we didn't include all of the questions within this topic area because we do have our own sister TAC, the Housing Accountability TAC, that is really kind of centering and responding to this specific category. So, but there is a question that we wanted to bring forward here, and that is, how does this rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? I think the final note that I'll make is, while we're spotlighting these two, all of the categories on the framework obviously intersect in both topic areas that the NAPTAC has. So in this particular topic area, which is focused on translation of types, characteristics, and locations, you can see multiple overlaps. But yeah, if you can lean into these two that I've noted today that for in the discussion, that would be great. And with that, I am going to hand it back to you, Deb.
Thank you, Madi. And as always, we'll do our best during conversation to bring those forward and make sure we're really thinking about those as we're contemplating the process of translating housing need. And we'll do a little check-in at the end on that as well. Okay, so moving on, as promised, Elise, you are, and I'm sorry, I did not even give your name properly, Elise Cordell Kennedy. But I will hand the reins over to you for overview.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. As Deb said, I'm Elise Cordell Kennedy. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Senior Research Analyst over at Oregon Housing and Community Services. So one of the other agencies who's involved in work on the ONA. So I'm just going to provide a quick overview of sort of OHCS's role in, let me share my screen and share the right one. So can folks see this presentation? Great, excellent. And then I'm going to get my little notes. So yeah, I'm Elise Cordell Kennedy, Senior Research Analyst. So I wanted to come and talk to you today really specifically about the dashboards that OHCS is responsible for. So OHCS is responsible for a couple of things in relationship to the ONA. But today I'm only going to focus on our role in creating and administering and having conversations around the data that will go into the dashboards, or another word that's often used is the inputs for the dashboards. So that's what we're going to review today. I'm going to try to keep to under 10 minutes, recognizing that there's a lot of stuff that folks want to get to in our meeting today. And then we'll have maybe a time for some questions quick. So what is OHCS responsible for in relationship to the ONA and the dashboards? So OHCS is responsible for creating a housing production dashboard and an equity indicators dashboard. And so this slide just sort of says what the data is or what the inputs are for each of those dashboards, right? So the housing production dashboard, the data that creates that will, one of the things will be the targets that are set from the methodology for cities. And those targets, there will be the total target of production and then also the subsidized or affordability target. And so we are responsible for putting those targets on the dashboard. And then the way that those will be sort of the inputs that allow us to know where a city is in sort of meeting those targets are from two places. We heard some feedback from folks in this group and other TACs that it would be easy and beneficial if we could align with the PSU housing survey and that goes out usually, I believe, in the summer. And so we are our partners at DLCD and ECHO and OHCS are actively engaged in working with the folks at PSU, Ethan, Huta to sort of design and add some questions to the survey that PSU already administers to make it easier for cities to fill out. So part of the input for the dashboard will be results from that survey. The third part is most of you have probably heard of the Oregon Affordable Housing Inventory, which OHCS is required to keep track of, right? And so that will answer the question of that publicly supported or affordable housing, that sort of less than 80% units for less than 80%. So that's how we'll keep track of that. The equity indicators is a little trickier, right? That dashboard's a little trickier. And so I'll cover that later in this slide, later in this presentation. But the data inputs, we'll sort of go through what those may be or what we hope for those to be. So just kind of getting back to, this is what the bill sets out as the housing production accountability dashboard should be and should cover. As I mentioned, sort of the data inputs, this is what we imagine on the right. This was sort of a mock-up provided in the legislative recommendations report published by ECHO Northwest that sort of says, this is what your total goal is. Again, this is for cities only with a population of 10,000 or greater. And then this is what your total unit goal is. And then this is what your subsidized or affordable goal should be. And so it will look sort of like this, and it will track what the goal is, and then it will track progress towards the goal from the data sources that I outlined in the previous slide. There will also be a comparative analysis of progress in comparison to the region and other local governments with similar market types. And that is work that is happening sort of right now on the methodology, in the methodology sphere. So more to come on that. The equity indicators, as I mentioned, a little more challenging, right? This is an important thing that we want to focus on. And we recognize that the limitations of the data to answer a lot of these really important questions are real and they are valid, right? This is what these 8 indicators are, what we are required to consider in order to comply with the ONA. So we recognize that a lot of these things are hard to answer. The data is really challenging to come by. And so we are working, and we have been working, I'll sort of go to the next slide here, that just sort of shares our timeline, the work that we have been doing to fill the gaps and understand the gaps on these equity indicators. So we've had the last 3 months really working with our partners at ECHO and DLCD to understand what the gaps in the data are and what the opportunities for filling those gaps are. We've done that internal work, and now we're moving into external work on that. So this month in May and next month in June, we'll be holding sort of these 2 types of focus groups. The technical group, right? That's for the folks who are really academic, who really want to get into the weeds of sort of the processes and the flows and the code and the breakdown. I sort of say that's like the nerdy group of folks who are really excited about the nerdy elements of the data, the limitations of it. They want to talk about like the nuts and bolts and really get in the weeds. So we'll be hosting those in May. I'm really looking forward to those ones. Then we'll move into the community group equity indicators conversations, or that we'll talk about things like, how is this showing up in your community? What does segregation look like, and how can we track that in a way that is or is not informed by data that is quantifiable or qualifiable? And then we'll have a series of sort of reports or memos that detail what we heard, right? We want to be really transparent in what we've heard, right? The good things, the bad things, the opportunities, the limitations. And so we'll be releasing some reports that share what we heard, both the work that we've done sort of here in the internal data quality conversations, and then also outlining what we heard from the technical folks, what we heard from the community folks, and then how that shows up or doesn't show up on a dashboard. And then there'll also be an opportunity to share, how can we make this process better? What do we need in terms of additional support from our governor, from the legislature, to say, we know we have these gaps in tracking accessibility. We know we have these gaps in tracking or defining segregation. And how can we make that better? How can we fill those gaps so that we have more information at the regional level, at the city level, so that everyone can make decisions that lead to more equity in housing. And then, of course, in January, we'll be publishing the dashboards. This is just a quick sort of outline around the housing production dashboard. So as I said, we sort of flip back and forth, but the housing production dashboard is a little, a little easier to explain, to articulate. The data is simpler. It's more clear. We have a better understanding of what inputs we will use in terms of data to track, right, progress towards housing production. That wraps up my presentation. So now we've got some time for questions. I think I will stop sharing, and yeah, hopefully that was quick enough, but not too quick to be overwhelming.
Great. Thank you, Elise. I'm hoping when we're done here, you can put into the chat maybe an email if people have follow-up questions beyond this, and a link for your web. I do see a couple of hands up, and I will make time, but I also want to just caution that we don't have a ton of time. We have a lot to cover in our discussion. But go ahead, Brock, questions.
Elise, how do we sign up to participate in the technical group meetings for the equity indicators data?
Yeah, so our sign up has gone out for that, and sort of the intention was really wanting to connect with academic folks who we know are experts in this space, and with the recognition that the folks here have lots of opportunities to engage in the RACs and the TACs and the NAPTACs and all of that. And so we really wanted to have an opportunity for folks who maybe haven't had as much engagement around that. So those invitations have gone out. But there will be an opportunity to see and provide feedback on sort of that document that I talked about, where we share what we heard, right? We share what folks are saying around the needs and gaps.
Thanks, Elise. Damien?
Thanks. Elise, I had a question about the work you're doing on the PSU housing survey. So every year they ask local governments for any data they have on what they call special housing units, or like where people might be living in motels, hotels, camping, shelters. Can you talk a little bit about more if that's just data you're going to try to get from those surveys, or if PSU is looking at changing that part of the survey to get some better data from local governments?
That's a great question. We are just beginning those conversations with PSU, and we've sort of talked about what they ask, what we would need to ask, and wanting to make sort of changes incrementally, not wanting to quickly change the process overnight. So I think like that is something that we've talked about in terms of the types, I think, which is some of the definitions that we'll be talking about later. I would say if you've got particular questions or feedback around that, probably the best place would be to just send me an email about that, so that I can track that, so that when we go into the meetings with PSU, we're just starting that process, that I can flag that and mention that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mary Kyle.
Hi, thank you. I had two questions. First, you mentioned that the dashboard is going to have total housing units and subsidized housing units, but cities are required to report more than that to DLCD under House Bill 2023 and the original Middle Housing Bill. So why don't we include those in the dashboard? And I have another question after that. Cities over 10,000 are supposed to report those.
Is this the question related to the income levels, the 0 to 30, 30 to 60? Is that what you're asking?
No, it's just the types of housing that are being produced. So the categories that are in House Bill 2023 are single family, ADUs, middle housing, multifamily, and subsidized, and accessibility. So will those be in the dashboard? Okay.
Yeah, I think that I don't want to say as in like yes. I want to say thank you for clarifying that. I think that the way that we intend, or I think hope to design the dashboard, is sort of in an incremental way, and the recognition that it will be about what we can put on the PSU survey, again, without sort of changing it immediately. And so I think that, go ahead.
Well, these are categories that are already required for cities to report to DLCD. So DLCD should have reports on all of those as of February 1st of every year from every city over 10,000. So I would hope those would be easily transferred to the dashboard when it first comes out.
And in relationship to, I think that's the 4006 reporting requirements for DLCD, that the survey that DLCD does every year to comply with
It's separate.
4006.
It's separate. It's a separate requirement.
Okay.
And the middle housing bill also requires reporting. So basically, DLCD should have a lot more information about housing types and characteristics based on 2 other bills, not just 4006, if cities over 10,000 have been reporting them, including accessibility and affordability. And then my second question was, at some point, will the dashboard include at least total numbers and subsidized housing numbers for all cities, including those under 10,000, because they all have a Goal 10 obligation to meet? And that would be, the dashboard would be useful, not just here. So maybe that's my plug for more funding to be able to do that.
Yeah, I would say to answer the second one, I certainly can't sort of answer that immediately,
Right.
but my understanding is for now, as it is stated, that the dashboard is to fit the bill for 10,000 cities, for cities with a population of 10,000 or more. In terms of how changes to that might be made in the future, I think is open for discussion. And I see Lorelai's got her hand up, so I'm hoping she can provide a little more context.
And I think Thea has some context too, so maybe between you. Thea, do you want to go ahead, and then maybe Lorelai will fill in if she knows something more?
Sorry, my buttons are sticky. Yeah, Mary Kyle, I don't want to take up too much time because I think that this is a, sort of a somewhat of a side conversation. So I will say that there's this is all required to be in the dashboard. All of what is in those bills that you mentioned will be in the dashboard. That's all information that's currently being collected, and we're working with PRC. It's a little sensitive right now because you don't want to blow out a survey that's working for them. But yes, to answer your question, very basic.
Okay. Thanks. Okay.
Anything more, Lorelai, to add?
Okay. All good. Thea got it. And we're required in the indicators, the equity indicators, to talk about housing mix and land efficiency. And that's where that's the obvious landing place for all those questions about housing type.
Cool.
Thanks
you.
for saying that better than I could.
Make sure
I appreciate
that it wasn't just total and subsidized, because those are the ones who were mentioned. Thanks.
Yeah. As you can see, we're still finding our way through this. Kim, please go ahead, and then you'll be the last question here.
More than a comment, it would be really helpful to know, what are the elements of the PSU survey? So what are the possible, what's the current efficacy and limitations? And I guess all of the data sources that will be used for the dashboard. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for that. We can share that as we move on developing that process.
Great, thank you. And as we hear about that, we can also share with NABTAC members here if they're not already on the distribution list. So thank you so much, Elise. And thank you all for your great questions, which feed really well into our discussion topic today about translating these ONA targets into needed housing that's contextualized at the city level. We're going to do things just a little bit differently today because, again, like as with the equity indicators and ONA dashboard, we're in the midst of sort of thinking about how this might work. And so the team, Mari and Celestina, are going to present some ideas that are in process, and then we're going to dig into sort of what you think about those, talk about some pros and cons, about some different pathways we may take to make this translation. So with that sort of stumbling introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Mari to get us sort of framed up. And our goal is to leave about at least 45 minutes for a discussion.
Thank you, Deb. And yes, so let's see. Over the last few meetings, we've been kind of unpacking the elements of housing types, characteristics, and locational attributes. Today, we are going to focus our discussion and kind of shift the tone of our discussion from what has been, really a very exploratory discussion of unpacking these elements towards, moving towards how these specific elements get defined in the Goal 10 process. So you received a discussion memo in your packet for the meeting for today. And within that memo, we've outlined at the very high level the Goal 10 process. I will do that in the meeting right now, and maybe offer some little nuances that might have not been in the discussion memo to ensure that we're all kind of starting and approaching the discussion with a common understanding, given that the knowing the landscape under the ONA paradigm and how the translation of the needed housing and the targets fit into that will be critical. So I'll do that, and then I'm going to shift it over to hand the mic, if you will, to my colleague Celestina, who will overview some potential pathways for that translation, and then we can open it up for discussion. Okay, so quickly, as I mentioned, the discussion memo did outline the general process for the Goal 10 process, and it kind of organized the process into 3 steps. But what you didn't see as detailed is kind of the step before the step 1 that's outlined in the analysis. So I'm going to start with that, and then I can dig into the rest. So we are now in a new paradigm. We've got with the House Bill 2001 that was passed in the 2023 session, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis policy is now the new paradigm for Goal 10 planning. Mary Kyle said it earlier, all communities are required to respond to their Goal 10 obligations. There are just some nuances for particular cities, like additional requirements within Goal 10 based on population threshold. But the ONA methodology is estimating the total number of needed housing units over a 20-year planning horizon for all communities across the state of Oregon. And it's divided into geographic regions, and the methodology considers various dimensions of housing need. And it will be divided into affordability brackets. Each local government receives a share of that allocation of regional housing needs from the state to help inform their planning requirements under Goal 10. The allocation specifically includes the number of units that the jurisdiction will need to produce, organized by affordability, to meet the share of its projected regional housing need over that 20-year planning horizon. And that's specifically tied to the housing capacity analysis. I mentioned there are additional requirements for communities that hit a threshold, and that was informed by House Bill 2003 in the 2019 session that required new requirements specifically for those communities with that threshold that meet that 10,000 population threshold, requiring them to produce a housing capacity analysis periodically on a either 6 or 8 year cycle, depending on where they're at, either inside the Portland Metro, so 6 years, or 8 years for those outside of the Portland Metro. There's that. Then there was an additional new requirement called the Housing Production Strategy on the same cycle, 6 years or 8 year cycle for those specific communities. Under the ONA, there is now a new requirement specifically for those communities that entails them receiving a housing production target. Elise, in her description, talked about that dashboard and displaying the targets. That's specifically the tie here with the HPS. And the target specifies the number of units that must be produced over the 6 or 8 year cycle for the jurisdiction. So different from the 20-year planning horizon piece that is captured in the HCA. So upon receiving the housing needs allocation, a local government then moves forward with kind of doing their planning requirements. Specifically addressing their 20-year housing need in the HCA and their 6 to 8 year targets and in the housing production strategy. 3 steps were outlined in the discussion memo. And I won't go into full detail, but I will note some specific things. The first step is the needs analysis. And the needs analysis, there are existing elements of the requirements from before the ONA paradigm that are still going to be considered in this step. What is new, though, is what Elise was overviewing, which is the dashboard and the equity indicators. These data sets are now will be available to support this particular work. So this particular step, step 1, the needs analysis. From there, local governments, after they've kind of done a deep dive and contextualized their needed housing on the ground, they move into step 2, which is the focus of our discussion today. That is taking their housing needs and those production targets for those communities that are on a 6 or 8 year cycle and responding to that and translating those into various housing types, characteristics, and location. Step 2 is kind of has been part of the previous paradigm, but is modified because the change that modified it was related to the needed housing statute that now has this translation piece that wasn't there before. So there is this requirement now. Local governments do perform a translation, and we'll dig into the pathways for how a local government can kind of do that translation in a minute. The last step is the development of the HPS report. So this is that action plan that includes and outlines strategies, policies, actions that a local government will take over a 6 or 8 year period, responding to those targets that they were assigned when they received the allocation. So with that, that's very high level overview. Please defer to the discussion memo for for a little bit more nuance, but that at least gives you kind of just a general idea of the general planning process requirements that local governments across the state are doing to respond to their Goal 10 obligations. I will, before I hand it off to Celestina, one last note that I'll say is this translation piece that we're focusing on today. There is an opportunity through this rulemaking. This is the intent behind our discussion today and will be the intent behind our discussion next week, is the opportunity to better support local governments in this particular work. We've been hearing loud and clear in this space in previous meetings and even at the RAC level, a call for a role for the department to play. And we haven't heard exactly what that role is, but today is that opportunity where we get to dive deep into what potential paths could be and consider, the benefits and maybe some cons to pathways. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Celestina to overview some pathways.
Thank you so much, Mari. In just a moment here, I'm going to screen share a table with various boxes and arrows that y'all have never seen. And while we wish that we had it prepared a week ago, as Mari mentioned, I think at the top of the meeting, the pace of this work is such that we have not. So I'm going to kind of spend a couple minutes getting us oriented to how we've framed out the potential paths for the relationship between the rules or DLCD and the local government doing both the translation work that we're talking about and the housing production strategy selection work that has already been in place, but now has a different relationship and orientation now that we've got the targets and the need to translate those into types, characteristics, and locations. So let me pull this up. Okay. So I will zoom in, I promise. But just so that you can have a lay of the land here for a moment, we've got the 3 steps that Mari outlined on the left-hand side. And this is getting to the Housing Production Strategy Report. One more time, we'll just mention that the HPS is not the only portion of Goal 10 work, but it is the portion that we're talking about today. And I will zoom into this gray box over here, which is just to acknowledge that next week we will be able to touch on how this translation work and kind of the framework for how the rules are written might interact with and inform some of the housing capacity analysis work that also relies on an assessment of needed housing. But today we're just looking at the process as it relates to the Housing Production Strategy Report. And that means that we're looking again at that 6 or 8 year target style of a number for the ONA targets is what we're calling them for the most part, allocation being for that 20-year cycle. So we won't spend time today on step 1, which is that needs analysis. We have some notes here in case after the meeting, as you all add notes, it's helpful to review some of those elements, being the fair housing issue areas that we talked about, the equity indicators that Mari just mentioned. There's already been contextualized housing need work that's part of Goal 10 work as it stands. So that's all the needs analysis work that informs this step 2 that is what part of what we are talking about today. So step 2 is to do this translation of this number, which is a set of mock targets that we wanted to provide so that we could really start to wrap our heads around what is it that that local governments are going to receive. And there will be, other information that's part of this needs analysis. But in terms of the translation, it starts with an allocation, and then we have to get to types, characteristics, and locations. So these are mock targets for a large city, which is over 25,000 in population on an 8-year cycle, so not in the metro area. So we've got our affordability brackets. We've got the number of units in each bracket. We've added a total number of units. And then on the side here, which exactly what's going to show up in the dashboard beyond what's required in statute is unclear, but whether it's in the dashboard itself or whether it's something on the back end that jurisdictions can do an analysis might be something like, well, what is the percent of the total for each of these brackets that we're aiming for? So that's an item there shaded in a different color. So I'll pause. Any questions there? I think y'all are probably up to speed because we've been circling this for a while, but okay. So we've got this to look at today. So one more time, these are potential paths for how DLCD writes the rules to support local governments in doing both this first part, the translation of those targets into types, characteristics, and locations to get to a mix, which is noted over here, and then bring that mix into the strategy selection portion. Now, to pull back the curtain, we were initially thinking that this meeting we might only talk about the translation rules. But as we started unpacking that, we realized that the degree to which those rules are specific or have flexibility, have safe harbors or don't, is informed by also how the rules are written at the strategy selection phase, because the analysis point is at the end of both of those, or I shouldn't say that the DLCD review phase is at the end of both of those steps in the Housing Production Strategy Report. So while the rules will require kind of separate parts of this process, they are related, and when you put them together, they will result in the Housing Production Strategy Report. So on the left-hand side, path A generally is less direction and more flexibility in rule. Path B is more direction, which almost always results in less flexibility. I think those are trade-offs that we're all familiar with at this point in the rulemaking process, but ultimately that's more or less what it comes down to. So on the left-hand side, we have option or a path A, which would be that there is not much in the rule with regard to how to do that translation. And essentially that cities, we've used the term show their work, explain why they've made the translation in response to their needs analysis. And if we run with that in terms of the translation rules, then we get to the strategy selection rules. And again, there could be no particular direction about how to select and prioritize strategies, or there could potentially be more direction, which would likely function as a safe harbor. For example, we've heard the idea, I think at the RAC level and potentially here, that there could be a minimum set of policies as a potential safe harbor, that if jurisdictions adopted those policies, that would be in compliance. On the right-hand side, we have a path where we start back up again with this translation of the targets into needs or into types, characteristics, and locations. And there are two different ways that we have brainstormed, and this also isn't limited. I'll just want to be clear on that. If y'all have a different path that you want to brainstorm for us about how DLCD could write the rules in support of local governments, please do. But so far, a way that more direction could be provided would be to provide guidance on how the translation should occur. Again, safe harbor style rules there. We've also brainstormed that the approach could be taken about what is not acceptable. If there are any, these would probably be items more on the extreme, if we want to use that word, about translation determinations that we know are not grounded. We could take that pathway. And then again, at the strategy selection phase, we just have both of those same options again, regardless of which, how the translation goes, at the strategy level, how specific should the direction be, if any. So again, one of the questions we have around all of this is, do y'all lean all one way, all another way? Or do you think one of these parts should have more direction and one should have more flexibility, which is why we've tried to pull them out. Any clarifying questions about this before Mari overviews some of our discussion questions? Julia?
Thanks. I just want to make sure I'm understanding, or that we're all on the same page in terms of what it means when we say safe harbor at this point in the process. So is like safe harbor, like even after there's the midpoint review, if the production just isn't happening, even though they adopted these like safe harbors, they're still good? Does it mean, and this I think probably overlaps with a lot of conversations that have been happening in the accountability TAC, but like I could see that being like one of the ways that they move into the lane that's being talked about in terms of like a lighter touch review versus like a deeper review. Anyway, I just want to be really clear to understand what we mean when we say safe harbor here versus like in the accountability part of the process.
I appreciate that, Julia. Very astute and helpful. These are actually completely separate moments of safe harbors. While they may end up aligning in some way if the accountability rules choose to do that, in many ways they're very distinct, because this is about the Housing Production Strategy Report review. And the options that the department has are to approve with conditions, or remand that report. And an approved Housing Production Strategy Report is just saying that, to everybody's best effort, we've made some good plans here, and the jurisdiction's going to implement those plans, and we will then see what happens. And if those plans work well, great. And if those plans turn out not to work well, then more support is needed. But I think a key distinction here is that an approved HPS report is just best laid plans and is not a safe harbor for what actually occurs Does that help? Okay.
Thanks, Celestina. Why don't you keep rolling here, and then we'll get into discussion, because I can start to feel it bubbling up here.
It's over to Mari for an overview of discussion questions.
Yeah, and thank you, Celestina. Could you, oops, I was just gonna ask you to move the Miro board in to note the boxes of the discussion points that were included in the discussion memo if possible. And then, yeah, the pros and cons. So I mean, you just learned a lot. Some exciting, hopefully exciting options that we want to dig in deep today. And I think and Celestina mentioned it. These are just paths that are draft that we developed to help kind of organize this discussion and prompt reaction from you all. And that really is kind of the overarching point of our discussion. What are those reactions? Let's talk about some of what you're liking, what sounds right, what feels like the right level, and maybe that's a pro of a particular pathway, or maybe what doesn't feel right, or could feel right if it had X. Maybe and so that broadly is an acceptable kind of frame to think about when we go into the pros and cons discussions, right? If we think about some of the paths that has less direction from DLCD staff to the local government and offers flexibility, that could be it has its pros and cons within, and we've outlined some of those in this table, right? So with the flexibility and less direction, local governments have a little bit more autonomy in that direction, in that translation of housing types, characteristics, and locations. But potentially could see, but with that flexibility, there's also the potential to, having consistencies across the state if there is not a structure in place. Then maybe what are the pros and cons of DLCD offering a little bit more guidance, a little bit more direction, which then means there is probably less flexibility. And so, but what could be the benefits, right? We've been hearing that the desire for that direction. So let's sit with that and how does that specifically local governments feel, and maybe talk about some of the trade-offs with that potential piece. So that's overarching. Then we've got 4 points of a discussion that were included in the memo, balancing exactly what I was just talking about, right? What is standardized and requires a little more direction versus what isn't standardized and offers the most flexibility to local governments. What is that right level? And then guidance in translation, how can we be clear in the options there, and the trade-offs with the rules specifically. And then, of course, we cannot forget and center our racial equity framework. That final discussion point is really kind of anchoring on the racial equity framework through the lens that we've been applying through all of our discussion, and specifically, thinking about the components of restorative justice and accountability and how that shows up in this particular discussion. I'm going to hand it back to Deb, who is our leader here in kind of facilitating this discussion. I'm excited to hear from you all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much. Just to clarify, if it wasn't already clear, it gets very complex very quickly when you're trying to take numbers of units that are target production and convert them into that list of types that's in statute and some other types that we've talked about, and convert them into characteristics like accessible units and tenure, and start thinking about location. It's sort of a 3D, or maybe there's a fourth dimension we're hitting here. And so what we've lined out for discussion here are, a couple of options to pick at these discussion questions. Cities on their own to figure out how to make that sort of shift, that translation into those types, characteristics, locations, or DLCD providing more direction on how to make that shift, but losing some flexibility and maybe ability to respond to local context. So that's where I want to start, is really just sort of checking in with you about how you feel about just this high level general, like balancing the flexibility with maybe providing more support or direction, guidance. It's more than guidance, it's specific direction from DLCD to cities how to make this work. Thank you, Alan. Please go ahead.
I apologize. I have to get out of here at 11 o'clock today. This is day number 8 on a new job, and I'm meeting with the program director today to kind of learn about our program.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, so here's a bit of a challenge for us on housing accessibility, physical accessibility, kind of in particular, is that there are not good standardized practices for collecting data on physical accessibility in the United States. The best data that would be available if we had all this stuff in our permit data and we were able to access that, it just doesn't exist in Portland, and I don't know what municipalities are actually collecting that type of data. And so I think that the approach here is that we need flexibility up front in understanding and determining this, but we need to have more specifications when we start to understand what are the mechanisms that we need to collect these data moving forward, and to not allow a lot of flexibility because of the safe harbors and the complexity that exists within accessibility, whether it's, HUD-related 504 compliance, whether we're talking about Oregon revised statutes, there are a lot of overlapping areas of the Venn diagram of how accessible units are produced. And so from here to kind of launch of data collection, I think we need flexibility, a lot of input. The best kind of standards I found at this point have been in Australia, which aren't going to kind of comport very well over here to Portland in the United States. There's other ideas that I'll end up sharing because I am one of those nerdy eggheads who's working on the indicators kind of group. So we'll kind of put those details together in there, but flexibility early. But when we get to asking people to collect certain data, there's going to need to be real specifics that we can't let people go outside of, so we're not comparing kind of apples to oranges moving forward. And I would just kind of undergird this all with, in my opinion, we should err on the side of more accessible housing because it's not exclusive. It's inclusive to anyone and everybody. So when we create a zero-step entrance, mothers, fathers, pushing strollers, cyclists can all get into a house. And when we put a stair or 10 in there, all of a sudden we're saying is that only people who are narrowly defined in the able-bodied kind of realm can get in there. So I'll continue this conversation outside of here. Thank you all for letting me go first here. And this is exciting work. Actually, I think this is where we're really going to find the opportunities for accessible housing kind of built in. And I'll just add one last thing. In my new role at Northwest Pilot Project, one of the challenges that we have specifically related to vouchers is the desire for the development community to have project-based vouchers and the desire from our clientele to have housing choice vouchers, which are going to be mobile and move around. And so putting all of those eggs into the kind of project-based vouchers is problematic when it comes to people finding those pieces of things like social connection, location equity, et cetera. And I'll be quiet there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. Some real food for thought about if DLCD is providing more direction, sort of places where it might be most effective for them to be very strict. So appreciate that. Jessica, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. In my opinion, I really lean towards that potential path A. I think about the work that our city has already done and all of the outreach to our local community that could potentially be lost if there's more heavy direction. It kind of takes that power away from community. And so, some of the thoughts that I had written down is, especially for cities that have already undertaken a lot of this work, capacity to redo a lot of this work when there was an extensive amount of outreach could be really problematic. And so it could kind of, I think about local control and our voice within our own community and our community's voice within that plan. And I don't want that to get lost somewhere in translation through statute. The community is really a driving factor in the work that we do. So I'd hate for that to get lost couple things that I had jotted down as well is like Pathway doesn't really take into account the work and creativity or collaboration that maybe some community partners have done in engagement to come together and really think about long-term regional solutions. And so, you know, if we move down like a Path B model, that work, innovation, creativity to really understand the needs of our community could potentially be lost. And so I guess I was kind of writing notes on each one, and one of the things that just keeps coming to my mind is that with the with right under Path A and then the letter A, it says show their work. I think that speaks volumes. And then, but I also don't think that every city has undergone the same work that the city of Salem has done through their program. So like, how does that work? And I think there could be a model for those that don't know how to get started, or, you know, my local community is very rural where I live. So, you know, to get started, technical assistance could be a huge piece to this, but also pairing them with communities of like size, you know, and having that, that database and having those plans that have been submitted. If there's something that really like makes sense for two smaller communities to maybe work together, I think there could be some value in technical assistance. And then alongside that, maybe some referrals to other communities that are doing it right. Give those communities the opportunity to do their work themselves and show their work before they're forced into maybe potential musts.
I appreciate that, Jessica, and I really appreciate you mentioning the sort of qualitative data that we also collect through our many engagements, and you all are obligated to collect. And for those about to speak, I know you have ideas. It'd also be good to hear, you know, if when thinking about this sort of this sort of Path A where cities have more control and flexibility, sort of what are some ideas for making sure that change is happening that's really needed? Because the past way we've been doing it has not been getting the outcomes we need. So just sort of seeding that, how do we make that change, and what might be needed? Go ahead, Damien.
I apologize, Damien. I am going to jump in just for a moment. And Jessica, you may already be tracking this, but just for clarity's sake, before we have all y'all continue to add and give your feedback, is that the Path B is not prescriptive. There is not a must. So providing a safe harbor, or even A2, even if strategy selection portion of this work had a safe harbor, it would not be a must. And it would only be a safe harbor, which, to explain that a little bit further, maybe would just be to say that if you choose to do it this way, you can rely on the fact that that will be found to be acceptable. And if you don't do it this way, there will be more discretion and subjectivity in assessing whether or not what you did do meets the requirements of the program. And then within that, or I guess in addition to that, an alternative way to provide more direction without requirements, without must, is defining the what's in the negative, so what you can't do. And then there's flexibility in everything that you could do. And then there's, again, that subjective assessment and determination, and a little bit less predictability you might hear in that explanation about the outcome of that. Like I said, you may already have been on that page, but just for everyone's sake, thanks so much, Deb, for the time.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I missed your hand up. Appreciate everyone helping me out with that. Now, Damien, please go ahead.
Thank you. Regarding the two potential paths, I was leaning toward pathway A, but with what I'm going to try to qualify as maybe some additional structure where there's more flexibility, but maybe more data and technical guidance that describes here's the how you do it, here's what you should be including, and then also looking at whether there's an option for providing data for cities to use where they can look at what types of housing might be affordable for each category, and examples from around the state, so that they've got some information they can look at and see where they could provide other options for housing, whether they can support, the types of units that are being underproduced, and look to peers to see, what other cities their size are doing, and get some ideas about how that might work in their community. And that might not be artful, but that's my initial thought about the pathway A. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and some helpful ideas about how that might work. Mary Kyle, please.
Hi, I think what Damien just said and Celestina's description are along the lines of what I am thinking of, which is these are described as sort of, for purposes of discussion, as two ends, I think, of a spectrum, regulatory versus full discretion. And as someone just said, full discretion has not worked. But there seems to be a hybrid in between, which would include things like DLCD providing a, constantly revising and updating the housing production strategies, providing best practices, model ordinances, all those sorts of things, and tagging or curating them, those strategies as to best practices to meet accessibility housing for those under 60% AMI, whatever it might be. And then a sort of a safe harbor, and I've heard the term safe harbor used several different ways, I think now, but that within boundaries, like if you have a particular need and there's a menu of options to pick from, and you pick, but it's within boundaries, you have to pick from these, or a city always has, it's in the existing housing production strategy, a city always has the ability to come forward and propose something they think will work better. So it's this hybrid mix of kind of curating strategies, saying you're kind of in a safe harbor, or you are in a safe harbor if you pick from this menu that best meets this kind of need. You can always propose something else, but it's not full discretion, and it's not everything is regulatory, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you. And I'm hearing sort of that those guidance documents, the menu of strategies, also tagging sort of the types, characteristics, locations of needed housing.
Right.
So people
know.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great, thank you. Brock, please.
Yeah, I would agree as far as translating, allow for flexibility, have a lot of guidance that cities can rely on if they want to. And, maybe safe harbors can be tied to like, hey, if you're using these guidance materials, right, that is a safe choice that you can make. And, that's not going to have as much harsh review on that. And then, shoot, I had one more other point I was going to make, and I'm drawing a blank right now. I'll circle back if I remember.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I so know that feeling. Julia, please.
Yeah, I just want to layer in. I'm also in favor of more of kind of a hybrid approach. Again, I think the existing HPS toolkit list that we have is a fantastic place to start with that. And it would be a big project, but adding further layers of coding that beyond what's already there in terms of, it acknowledges income levels, displacement risk, those types of things. So layering in the other kind of required needs, tactics and responses to that, I think would be a great way to do that. So that again, cities, as they're putting in those strategies, I think the requirement should be that they are clearly drawing that line between this is the need, this is the strategies that we're doing to solve this. I'd also note with that, I think that would create a really great data set, so to speak, for DLCD then to have kind of an iterative process to, as they're doing these analyses and looking at the dashboards, be able to take these strategies seem to work really good for these areas, these populations, these types of economies. To me, that then can become the foundation for what we're calling safe harbors for this. I really hesitate to say that we could come up with safe harbors right now that will actually be effective, because I feel like we don't really have the data yet. And so seeing what becomes the best process, what is showing results, those become the safe harbors in the next iteration of kind of ONA updates and things like that to me. And so again, I just see this huge benefit of leaning into that list, really trying to get cities to reference it, and yes, supporting innovative new ideas that are kind of outside the box as well, because we don't know everything yet. So just wanted to layer that in.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. Appreciate that. Garland, thoughts?
I've been thinking of answers to all 4 of the questions from the memo, so I'm just going to run through them.
Thank you.
So in terms of balancing flexibility and standardization, the housing production target should translate into roughly 20 to 25% of the zone capacity of each jurisdiction. So each housing production strategy report should thus plan to rezone as necessary to increase capacity until capacity equals 4 to 5 times the housing production target. Existing infill locations should be used to meet 100% of this capacity through rezoning. And this will then give the market the flexibility to acquire properties from willing sellers to develop to produce the needed housing production without limiting upzoning so much that it induces market speculation and property price appreciation. And this must include housing types most likely to produce the target number of units by affordability bracket. So 4 to 5 times the zone capacity for each appropriate type needs to be provided by bracket. And then in terms of guidance on translation, yes, DLCD should provide guidance on the types of housing products most likely to produce units by affordability bin, as well as on locational characteristics to support affordable living for each type. So in order to qualify to meet the housing production target, all units in affordable bins under 120% AMI must be within walking distance along a walkable network to grocery stores, services, amenities, etc. And then in terms of safe harbor rules, then this could include that if a jurisdiction has a plan that says zone capacity equals or exceeds 5 times the housing production targets by affordability bin, using a crosswalk table of housing types to bin categories in locations that could be classed as complete walkable communities or that will become such communities within the planning horizon per a package of programmed, allocated, and fully funded infrastructure improvements and other planned and funded efforts, right? And sufficient subsidy dollars exist to deliver the homes in affordability bins requiring subsidy. And all identified locations are infill or refill sites with no urban growth boundary expansion required. And sufficient tools are provided, such as tenant opportunity to purchase or right of first refusal legislation to allow tenants to purchase their apartment buildings for conversion into housing co-ops to provide pathways to prevent displacement. If that was your set of safe harbor rules, then you knew that any jurisdiction that complied with those rules would be farthering goal 10 and other policy goals that we have for this. And I would say that last point about displacement tools would be one way that I would suggest to integrate racial equity in the translation process is to pair that with outreach to targeted communities. And that's what I have for right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Garland. Really appreciate that. And some of the conversation around trade-offs and safe harbors, we're definitely hoping to dig in. I mean, we're happy to talk about them today, but also planning on digging into those more next week. So we'll take those and keep going with that. Shannon, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just echoing some sentiments already shared. I think I have what I hope is a helpful clarifying just question for my own understanding. So I think we're talking about rules and making rules. And I just want to think about that for a second and make sure. So when I think of rules, I'm thinking of something we want to be like durable for some time. And then implementation could be more variable. So I guess just as the way my brain works is maybe it's helpful to have and maybe this speaks to the hybrid kind of approach that others have mentioned, to maybe have the rules allow for flexibility and a program developing over time, and then initial implementation being more suggestive. Right? Like, can we make a differentiation there perhaps that at least the first go around, as this is new to everyone, maybe implementation wise, it makes sense to err on the side of being prescriptive. Like if you as a city, maybe with less staff, are wondering what to do, like these suggestions are strong suggestions, and if you pick these things, you're going to be okay. But then maybe over time, as everyone like learns how to do this together, those suggestions are a little later. Or if it's going to go to this really sort of strong prescriptive path, in that case, it seems like there'd want to be a safety valve for innovation, because we all know, that there are best practices and then innovation and tension, right? So some kind of just, I feel like everyone is saying, and I'd just like to echo the suggested balance between, what are the rules? What are we trying to achieve? How do we provide as much sort of surety on the front end of a program as we can? And also make sure that we're allowing for learning and adjusting and trying new things over time. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate that. And sort of hearing that, the guidance, if it is that way, if it's not in rule, the guidance needs to be really robust and truly help communities who don't, or cities who don't have staff or haven't been through this before to find their way through it effectively. So I appreciate that. Brock, you remembered what you wanted to say.
I did. Celestine, I know you had your hand up too, if you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Brock.
That's okay. Sure, Brock. Thank you. I guess, and if this doesn't apply to your responses, Brock and Sam, feel free to ignore it. But as the conversation continues to iterate for a little bit longer, I would be curious to know if you all have opinions about there being any difference between safe harbor approach or really very little direction at all, which is really path A, specific to the translation process as different than the strategy selection process. And maybe it's not, maybe the thoughts are the same about both steps of those, but I've just been hearing the higher level responses. And also for anyone who's continuing down kind of the language of like a hybrid or a middle path, I would love to hear more about maybe looking at this, and I know it's hard to follow, but or finding some way to articulate what about that sounds hybrid, knowing that we are not going to prescribe, and like that's not on the table that DLCD prescribes a certain path at all. The must isn't on the table, but whether or not a safe harbor is even provided at all is on the table versus a lot of flexibility. And at each of these levels, at the translation level and the strategy selection level. And I have heard notes about that, but just if anyone has additional thoughts about those distinctions, I'd be curious to continue to hear that unpack. Brock.
Directly to that, I would say safe harbor should be available for cities that want to use those if they have low staff capacity and they need to rely on those safe harbors to be comfortable with the plan that they're putting forward. Then I think that's the option that they need. But if they don't feel that they need to use those safe harbors and they have the capacity to be able to develop the plans on their own and develop those translations on their own, that's something they should be able to do as well. The other point that I was going to bring up previously, 1.5 points, housing markets are very local. Right. And so what we see developed in one and developed in another, right, we might be able to aggregate data across the state and say like, hey, here, generally, these are kind of things that work for this, this, and this, right? At the same time, we're also going to be getting data, not just as a state as a whole, but we're going to be getting data from each and every city that's doing this. And so when we do that, if there's a deficiency in, the first time they implement their strategy, right, go back, look at the data, use that to make an informed decision about what updates and what the next strategy might need to look like. Part of that might come through housing acceleration program, right? For cities that don't necessarily meet the threshold to get put into the program, or, that don't have or the DLCD doesn't have the capacity to review all the ones that potentially were, as they were talking about in HOTAC yesterday. Right. Then, you have that ability to just say like, hey, here's the things that you fell a little bit short on. Right. Let's look at the data of what you guys have done. And then as we build that over time, we're going to get more and more data about what strategies are responsive locally. The other question that I want to bring up, and I don't know that it necessarily is direct to this question, but as a broader thought here, when we're talking about affordability, looking at the bill and the statutes, we're talking about the affordability of the home. We're not looking at cost of living overall, because those are two very different questions, and one is very far outside the scope of this rulemaking. There's one thing to say, yeah, we need to produce housing at all of these affordability levels. Absolutely. I think everybody here on this rack agrees with that. But if we're talking about cost of living overall, there's a lot of different policy discussions that go into that. I'm not saying these are options that we should use. I'm just saying as a theoretical, thought experiment, right? Cutting gas taxes, that reduces transportation costs, but I don't think that's a direction the state wants to go, right? If we want to have more affordable land, we can completely eliminate UGBs, right? But again, I don't think that's the direction the state wants to go. So when we're talking about affordability, let's talk about the affordability of the housing and not the cost of living, which is far beyond the scope of the rulemaking.
Thanks, Brock. Good correction there. And I just we have about 10 minutes left. I want to highlight, Brock mentioned some elements of accountability, but I do want to think about our racial equity framework. The fourth question prompts, how can the translation process ensure equitable outcomes for communities of color and other marginalized populations? We heard from Alan at the top about maybe some ways that this could be adjusted to focus in on accessible units. So I just want to keep thinking about the restorative justice and the accountability pieces and what these translations could or couldn't mean, or how it kind of works in the translation process to be considering marginalized communities of color. So with that, Sam, I'll put it in your lap. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point I was going to make for why there should be more DLCD guidance in terms of translation. I think that for generations, cities have been picking their residents rather than residents being able to pick their cities. And yeah, so I would suggest that there does need to be more guidance. Now, I think that there is flexibility within that for the facts on the ground, in terms of, like as I read the Path B proposal on that, rules that define the factors. So if, for instance, if OHCS DLCD determined that a factor was, well, this area needs more vacation or has a need or a higher demand for more vacation housing, then that's going to, create some regional variation or jurisdictional variation. But I do think that the state should be the one to lead that process. On the strategy side, I do think that there can and probably should be more flexibility, because we hear consistently from cities that, especially smaller or less resource jurisdictions, that they don't even have the means to meet the best practices, the very minimal best practices as far as the strategy selection. I also wouldn't want the state to, put a hamper on possible really good possibilities for new strategies and innovation on the front.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate you making that distinction. Jessica.
So to follow up on my, after there was some more insight provided after my first comment, I think that, I guess where I thought Path A was more of like that B1 of like rules define factors that must be considered. I think accessibility obviously falls within the must. And we have federal regulations that define some of those things as well. So I think we're all comfortable with that piece. But I like the rules provide safe harbors for how cities can. I like that language. I think it's just the must language gets me a little like, oh my gosh, what if we can't do that? But I completely agree with the strategy piece of A2. So if I were to pick today, I would say B1, A2, as far as translation and strategy, because I really like A2 says rules could provide safe harbor. And then the expectation that a certain number of minimum policies are adopted, I think is how we really address that number 4. And so, so I feel comfortable with that piece, with that extra clarification. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jessica. And I saw a few thumbs up for your endorsements of those sort of pathways, or the, maybe general direction of those pathways. Mary Kyle, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say I was a little uncomfortable with the statement that there's no must here or whatever, because there is a must in the law. Cities must meet the housing needs, and the starting point is the housing production strategies, and that's in Goal 10, as well as the statutes that we're talking about. So it can't be full discretion. We will not be serving the housing needs of Oregonians. So I think we're all talking about, I think I think the LCD should provide safe harbors that is a starting place for cities, and they can also propose their own, but they must meet certain factors that are tied to their own individualized housing needs based on the allocations and their contextualized housing needs. So it's kind of a mix of that guidance, which has no legal enforceability, and a structure that should have some, and factors that should have some legal enforceability. And I just have to say, I completely disagree that the only thing we are looking at is the affordability of the house to purchase or rent. We have far more things in the law that we're supposed to be taking care of and looking at, including in Goal 10, which talks about types of housing and location, and affirmatively furthering fair housing, which brings in all of these issues. So I just have to make that point. Thank you.
I really appreciate you making that point, because that is exactly right. It does bring in all of the sort of fair and equitable housing pieces, the affirmatively furthering fair housing issue areas we've been talking about the last few weeks, as well as these, even the types aren't just about the structure. If you all recall in the statute, the types also speak to certain housing for agricultural workers as an example, housing for older persons. So there's sort of that's already starting to shape up how there are specific people that do need to be considered in this needed housing mix, as well as characteristic and location, which as we've been talking about, get at the AFFH too. We have just a couple of minutes left. Oh, Celestina, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to absolutely affirm you, Mary Kyle, in that there are absolutely many musts that we are all here sorting out. The comment that I made about there is no must on the table is about exactly how the rules will be written to say that a city must make this translation of this target into this set of housing characteristics, for example, and that we're trying to sort out, given that we are not doing that, what can we do? But I just want to absolutely affirm there are many musts in the program overall.
Thanks. I just get a little nervous about statements like that. Thank you.
For sure. No problem. Understandable.
It's good grounding. I'll just interject here and say it's good grounding, Mary Kyle. I'm happy that you lifted it up, and it really affirms, the journey we've all been in unpacking the housing types, characteristics, locations, and even the last meeting, right? We've been talking about how to integrate fair AFFH into the Goal 10 process, and we had a really robust discussion about the possibilities of those fair housing issue areas and how they show up. So, yeah, definitely goes beyond affordability. So thank you for lifting it up. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to move us into a recap rather than initiate more conversation with 6 minutes left. I do just want to kind of check in and make sure I heard things right. And I would look to my colleagues to weigh in as well. And Alan, I know you've been patiently listening. So if you have other insights, I'd really welcome those. But I definitely heard a lot of diversity of opinion, and yet also recognition that flexibility, at least for some time, is probably needed and warranted until we really understand sort of what could be effective and what sort of translations are working best for communities in various conditions. That has an asterisk on it. There are things that absolutely must be addressed, and the translations need to address. And there's also a desire among many of you that spoke today to make sure, either in rule or guidance, that there's just some really strong direction on the pieces that are getting at communities of color and other marginalized communities. What else did I mean, I'm sure I'm not the best listener as I'm trying to manage this, but what else did I miss, or what else did you hear, Alan or Lorelei?
I think you captured it pretty well, Deb. Appreciate that. The piece where I'll go is where I usually go into kind of flying up higher and making sure there's some context to where we're headed. And I think that'll come into play in the next meeting when we also add in kind of the bigger picture of all the things we're doing together. And again, since we were talking about must, ultimately, the statute requires that we must demonstrate that we're meeting the translation is one piece of it, but overall that we're demonstrating that we're meeting, several parts of this, which does include that affirmatively furthering part. And so I think we kind of dove down today to look at the translation piece, and we'll have to dive back up to understand that it's one piece of what we're trying to accomplish in that part of it. It's an important piece, but there is a bigger picture too that this all is part of. And so I think that how we get there matters, and what we talked about today, but ultimately there is a destination that we're headed to together.
Alan, I so appreciate that reflection, and also just a little whetting of the appetite for our discussion next week. And as promised too, I mean, I also heard the sort of balancing and maybe kind of, I don't know, everyone's sort of trying to sort out how or if a safe harbor is part of that process so that a city could demonstrate that they're addressing the needed housing in their HPS. Other reflections about what we talked about today, and or reflections on how well we did in addressing our racial equity framework questions around restorative justice, and I guess I think restorative justice, yes, sorry, I don't have it in front of me, and accountability. We touched on it, could always get more.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't really hear any good answers to how the translation process ensures equitable outcomes for communities of color and other marginalized populations and communities, aside from the one that I gave and this constant refrain of engagement, engagement, engagement. And so I'd just like to flag that for next week. I would like to hear better answers to that question. Specific answers, actionable answers, the sorts of answers that could make their way into safe harbor regulations.
Thanks, Garland. I do want to acknowledge we did hear from Alan at the very beginning about accessibility and specific ideas about how that might be advanced that way. But thank you for challenging us to get more specific on that front. Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say about that is I think it will, my hope is that we can cover it more a little bit next week, because we are going to talk further about kind of the two end pieces of this, the HCA and the HPS, which will bring in, I think the HCA can bring in that contextualized housing piece for a city that you really need to capture. Are there some inequities based on race, other protected classes that you need to be grappling with as a city? And then on the HPS side, what tools and strategies are you putting in place to specifically address those? So I think it's the same piece. I think today was very much like the pre-paradigm piece, where it's that technocratic numerical exercise of translating, and really expanding that to think about how that fits to either address historical inequities and what tools and strategies actually do that. So it would be great, I think, Garland, as you said, to hear some specifics about, particularly from cities that might identify that need, how we can address those things, and how we should hold folks accountable for that in those processes.
Thank you. I really appreciate that additional context and sort of, again, bigger picture, how this all knits together. As we, so I'm going to bring us to a close. As we always do, Madi is going to share a link to the Miro board. We did not talk ahead of time about the sort of feedback mechanism with the Miro board. I am thinking, though, it might be helpful if folks could add sticky notes if you have questions about that table, which will be there. But then there also is the note section that you can add some additional comments we didn't get to today. Celestina or Madi, thoughts on sort of feedback opportunities?
I think we'll frame it out like y'all are probably used to by now, at least those of you who this tool works well, where we've got the red area, which is the area to add more notes. And so I think it might not be exactly one-to-one like some of the other Miro boards have been, but hopefully we'll make it clear where you can add your notes.
Great, thank you. Madi, any final comments before we close?
Well, other than appreciation, thank you everyone for the feedback. But I also was curious if we could do an inquiry about how people feel of the possibility of extending our meeting 30 minutes for next week. This meeting is the last meeting of the NAPTAC before we take a break in June. Staff is moving in the direction of taking all this great feedback since we started in March, and we dove into some of the really good translation pieces, but there's more to dig into, and even those additional 30 minutes next week could be helpful. So we're not planning for it, but I do want to, if you could do a thumbs up, as I see Brock and Julia, if folks feel like, okay, well, excellent. Thank you. That might be something that you'll see come through with an update of the calendar invite. So appreciate that. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. Thanks for picking that up, Madi. All right, we will probably then just send you an updated calendar invite with an extra half hour just to hold that time, and we'll be following up. Thank you all so much for the discussion today, as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.